Picking up in The Image of Bar Kokhba in Traditional Jewish Literature, False Messiah and National Hero by Richard G. Marks. Picking up still in chapter 1 on page 36 with the title, The Kuthian. In rabbinic legends, Kuthians, a name usually synonymous with Samaritans, are generally portrayed as hypocrites, idol worshippers, and cunning tricksters who try repeatedly to harm the people of Israel. Footnote 51. The Simon of Acts 8, 9-24, known in ecclesiastical tradition as Simon Magus, has a distinct resemblance to the image of Samaritans, although Acts never states that he was a Samaritan. As a magician, Simon distorts reality and deceives people. Before his conversion, he is a heretic. According to the ecclesiastical tradition, Simon reverts to sorcerer and becomes an ideological opponent of the Apostle Peter, like the Kuthians portrayed in rabbinic legends as ideological opponents of the sages. See Eusebius, Ecclesiastical Histories, 2.8 on Simon Magus and 3.26 on Meander the Samaritan. End of footnote. The Kuthian of the Ben Kokhba legend is portrayed similarly as a malicious and guileful enemy of Israel. Only such a one as he could have overcome Ben Kokhba, because first he perceives, from his knowledge of Israelite life, the importance of Rabbi Elazar in the defense of Beitar. Second, appearing to be an ally or perhaps an Israelite, he can enter Beitar and attack from within. This role in the story accords with the anomalous position that Kuthians occupy in rabbinic thought, neither a part of nor a part of Israel, difficult to define as to halakha and doctrine. Footnote 53. Oh, I'm sorry. We missed a footnote there where they're defining Samaritans as tricksters, etc., whatever. It reads, for example, a legend in Midrash Genesis has Kuthians collaborating with Rome to prevent Israel from rebuilding the temple. They succeed by slandering Israel to the Romans and using inside information about halakha to Israel's disadvantage. And that goes to the footnote 52, which is in Genesis, Rabbah 44:10, end of that footnote. But the next one, coming after this sentence, this role in the story accords with the anomalous position that Kuthians occupy in rabbinic thought, neither a part of nor a part of Israel, difficult to define as to halakha and doctrine. Footnote 53. In halakhic matters, such as circumcision, marriage, wine, and the Sabbath, the sages had repeatedly to decide on the status of Kuthians, or Samaritans, in brackets, because they were an anomaly, like uncircumcised, unobservant, or apostate Jews and minors. Samaritans shared much of the same scripture and laws with Jews, but they also diverged significantly in several points of doctrine and practice. End of footnote. That would be interesting to explore. The differences there at that time, too, or whatever. Anyway, end of that footnote. Furthermore, the Kuthian possesses the character traits necessary to overcome Ben Kokhba, succeeding by deceit and flattery where physical strength has failed. The Kuthian succeeds by playing upon the flaws in Ben Kokhba's character, revealed thereby as credulity, suspicion, and a quick temper. In particular, the episode shows up Ben Kokhba's credulity, his lack of astute intelligence. This is another trait characteristic of several Gibborim in rabbinic legends and scripture, which portray them as rough, simple-minded folk who cannot quite comprehend the intricacies of Torah and human affairs. For example, sages criticize Abner for starting a war because of his erroneous exegesis of scripture, and rebuke Jephthah and Gideon for committing bloodshed and idolatry through their ignorance of the law. Footnote 54. Abner, Genesis Rabbah 82:5, Ruth Rabbah 4-6, Gideon, Genesis Rabbah 44:20, Leviticus Rabbah 22:9, Jephthah, Genesis Rabbah 63, Leviticus Rabbah 37:4, and a footnote. In the book of Judges, Samson resorts more to his strength than his brains, and is conquered by a cunning woman. Heracles, too, is overcome by means of an unknowingly clever stratagem. Heracles, too, is overcome by means of a clever stratagem, this one set up by a devious centaur, and carried out unknowingly by Heracles' own wife. In these stories of Heracles, Samson, and Ben-KOKHBA, cunning is the final victor over brute strength, an idea found in the legends of many cultures. But when cunning meets cunning, as in the contest between Kuthians and sages recounted in rabbinic legend, it is always the sages who come out ahead. They are shown outwitting the Kuthians at their own game, as when, for example, Shimon ha-Sadiq foils the Kuthian plot to trick Alexander the Great into destroying the temple, and then induces him to destroy the Kuthian temple instead. Footnote 55. Babylonian Yoma 69a, Genesis Rabbah 94:7, Ecclesiastic Rabbah 5:10, and a footnote. In the light of these legends, it is significant that Ben-KOKHBA fails in his contest with the Kuthian. One implication is that Gibborim, like Ben-KOKHBA, lacked the requisite intelligence for effective leadership, and that the sages possesses this intelligence and a deeper understanding of reality, are better suited to lead the nation. A large portion of the Ben-KOKHBA story is devoted to the Kuthian, although later writers show no interest in him, and all this attention suggests a certain fascination with what the Kuthian represents. Interpreted phenomenologically as a perception of reality, the Kuthian manifests a dangerous and deceptive world where the unwary are easily tripped up. Both this episode and Rabbi Elazar's prayers show the reader that reality is more complex than Gibborim think it is. Prayers reach beyond the realm of the Gibbor's physical strength, and Kuthians confound any simple perception of human affairs. Next title, Ben-KOKHBA's downfall. In the encounter with the Kuthian, Ben-KOKHBA exhibits a lack of discernment and an inability to see. Likewise, with his execution of Rabbi Elazar, Ben-KOKHBA judges the sage impetuously, uncritically, and without the due process prescribed by rabbinic jurisprudence. This reflects the same character flaw revealed already by his battle prayer and overweening pride in his own power, which is also an attitude characteristic of Gibborim. The fatal flaw, then, in Ben-KOKHBA's character is his blind reliance on his strength to the exclusion of all else, which makes him vulnerable to the Kuthian and unjust to Rabbi Elazar, ultimately brings his downfall. God acts now to punish Ben-KOKHBA. When Ben-KOKHBA had wanted to prevent and tried to deny God's involvement in the war, God's presence in human affairs, now reveals itself clearly. Divine judgment is pronounced by a voice from heaven, and its words reflect the storyteller's understanding of what Ben Kosova's death signified, the judgment of God upon a sinner. A bat quo went forth, saying, Woe to the worthless shepherd who abandons the flock. The sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall be wholly withered, and his right eye utterly blinded. Zechariah 11:17. You slew Rabbi Elazar of Modoim, the arm of all Israel, and their right eye. Therefore your own arm shall be wholly withered, and your own right eye utterly blinded. Immediately, Batar was captured and Ben Kosova was killed. Jerusalem Talmud. The verse from Zechariah is particularly appropriate. In its scriptural context, it refers to wicked rulers who neglect their duty to protect and guide the people. By applying the verse to Ben Kosova, the Bat Kol, heavenly voice, calls him a worthless leader who abandons the flock. By killing Rabbi Elazar, its true shepherd, and so leaving Israel defenseless before the Roman slaughterers. The verse is apt also because it speaks of a warrior dying in battle. His punishment is to lose his strength, his arm, and accuracy, his right eye, The two chief virtues of a Gibor, and then to die powerless before the enemy. His punishment is to lose his strength, his arm, and accuracy, his right eye. The two chief virtues of a Gibor, and then to die powerless before the enemy. Ben Kosova's punishment, as phrased in the following exegesis of the verse, is conceived according to the traditional logic of Mida keneged Mida, measure for measure. The idea that the reward or punishment of an action corresponds to it in kind, because Ben Kosova has destroyed Israel's strength, which is Rabbi Elazar, Ben Kosova must forfeit his own strength. By calling Rabbi Elazar the arm of all Israel, the heavenly voice states clearly an idea that has been merely implied before, that Ben Kosova's military successes had depended on Rabbi Elazar's prayers and ultimately on God's mercy. Moreover, addressed to Ben Kosova directly, his revelation resembles in function what Aristotle calls anagnosis, the tragic hero's recognition of the truth about himself, as occurs, for example, with the Oedipus of Oedipus Rex. In the rabbinic story, Ben Kosova discovers that his glorious strength had in truth been nothing without Rabbi Elazar's prayers, and in the end had served only to destroy the very cause for which he had fought. The irony is intense. Such tragic irony is another point of similarity between Greek tragedy, particularly the drama of Sophocles. There are other similarities, like tragic heroes. Ben Kosova is a man of superior abilities, whose actions display a fatal hubris. Aristotle's term hamartia, flaw, mistakes, aptly describes the weakness in Ben Kosova's character that brings about the downfall. In addition, Ben Kosova's recognition of the hidden truth, anagnorisis, occurs exactly at the dramatic moment that Aristotle calls peripetia, the sudden reversal of the hero's fortunes. Footnote 56, Aristotle, The Poetics, Loeb Classical Library, 1927, chapters 13 and 16, Alban Lesky, Greek Tragedy, translated, H.A. Frankfurt, New York, 1964, chapters 1, 4 to 7. End of footnote. Nevertheless, Ben KOKHBA differs in one significant way from Greek tragic heroes. He is not involved in an irresolvable conflict so much as in a rebellion that could have ceased and been forgiven. Footnote. See Leski, Greek Tragedy, Chapter 1, for his argument that tragedy always involves an insoluble conflict. He distinguishes between a totally tragic worldview, a total tragic situation, and a tragic situation. The story of Ben KOKHBA fits none of these types of tragedy, because he is always free to trust and obey God. End of footnote. Moreover, the tragic effects of Ben KOKHBA's story can be explained fully from earlier Israelite conceptions of the divine-human relationship. Isaiah's oracle, mentioned earlier, for example, accuses Sennacherib of presuming to have conquered the nations by his own power. 2 Kings 19, 21-28. Cf. Isaiah 10, 12-15. The same hubris, recognition, and irony are implied. Such similarities as exist between the Ben KOKHBA story and Greek tragedies, therefore derive mainly from the similarity of dramatic situation, a heroic individual setting himself up against a higher order or will that, unknown to him, controls his life. Hadrian's eulogy. Ben KOKHBA dies in battle, and the last scene offers one final picture of the man, a final judgment passed by those who told his story. A snake is found coiled around his body, an especially fitting form of punishment for a Gibor, since it completely nullifies his strength. The snake is an agent of divine retribution, as we learn from numerous legends and comments elsewhere in rabbinic literature. For example, Rabbi Abba B. Kahana said, "Never does a snake bite unless it has been incited from above," and Rabbi Shimon B. Yonai taught that the snake, for its trespass in the Garden of Eden, was made executioner of all other trespassers. Footnote 58. Ecclesiastes, Rabbah 10:1. See also Genesis, Rab 10:7. Leviticus, Rab 22. 4. Pasikta Rabbatai 30.3, and Babylonian Talmud, Shehab 15. That would be, Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 15. 156a. End of footnote. Death caused by snakes then represented retribution from heaven. And in Ben KOKHBA's case, it meant that he was brought down not by Rome, but by God. This is the conclusion that Hadrian draws, and it gains in authority coming from Ben KOKHBA's foremost enemy, ruler of the mighty Roman Empire. The scriptural verse quoted by Hadrian, "Not unless their rock had handed them over," adds a tone of authority, dignity, and finality to this last verdict upon Ben KOKHBA. Footnote 59. Pasikta Rabbatai 30.3 translates the verse in this way: "Had not the Holy One, blessed be He, brought us into your hands, you nations of the world could not have prevailed against us." In the predominant understanding of this verse, found also in Genesis, Rabbah 44:21, Exodus, Rabbah 51:7, Pasikta Derav Kahana 5.2, and Pasikta Rabbatai 15.2, it is read as a reference to Israel's subjugation by the nations, showing that Israel had been defeated not by them, but by God as punishment for its sins. End of footnote. As the foregoing analysis suggests, That verdict judges him both hero and sinner, praising him as it condemns him. It expresses the contradictory feelings, pride, and disapproval that later generations felt towards the man. Hadrian's eulogy casts Ben KOKHBA on the one hand as a great and splendid hero, the magnificent opponent of Rome, whom Rome had never conquered, and it cast him, on the other hand, as a reprehensible sinner who, for misusing his strength, had it taken away by God. To Ben KOKHBA's glory, he was never conquered by men, and to his shame, God had directly intervened to strike him down. This understanding of Ben KOKHBA's defeat both comforts and warns later generations. It leaves his glory and heroism intact while proclaiming his sins, and it affirms the power and justice of God in history while nullifying the accomplishments of Rome. Explaining the nation's defeat as divine punishment derives directly from the prophets and Deuteronomic writers. Since in this view, God had used foreign nations as the rod of my anger, Isaiah 10:5, Jerusalem had not really been conquered by Babylonia, but by the anger and wrath of the Lord, Jeremiah 32:31. Yet the prophets never drew the further conclusion that Nebuchadnezzar needed God's help because Jerusalem was otherwise unconquerable. So when the tellers of Ben KOKHBA's story use Hadrian's eulogy to praise KOKHBA for never having been conquered by Rome, they reinterpret the prophetic idea. Beitar's end. Following immediately upon Hadrian's eulogy in both the Jerusalem Talmud and Midrash Lamentations, a series of traditions recalls the Roman massacre of Beitar's population. And they, the Romans, went on killing them until horses waded through blood up to their nostrils, and the blood rolled rocks weighing 40 seah until the blood reached the sea 40 miles away. You might say that it, Beitar, is closer to the sea, but it is not indeed 40 miles from the sea. But is it not indeed 40 miles from the sea? They say that on just one rock they found the brains of 300 children. They also found 3 baskets of phylactery capsules of 9 seah each, and some say 9 baskets of 3 seah each. It teaches, Rabbi Shimon B. Gamliel says, there were 500 schools in Beitar, and the smallest of them had not less than 500 children, who said, if the enemy comes upon us, then we shall go out against them with these styluses and pierce their eyes. But when sins brought it to pass, they, the enemy, wrapped each and every child in its scroll and burned them to death. And none remained of them, all except I. And he applied to himself the verse, my eye torments me because of all the daughters of my city. Lamentations 3:51. Hadrian the Wicked had a vineyard 18 miles by 18 miles, as far as from Tiberias to Sepphoris. They surrounded it with a wall of the slain inhabitants of Beitar, a whole body's length in height, and an arm's reach in width. And he did not decree that they should be buried until another king arose, and decreed that they could be buried. Our Huna says, Rabbi Huna, when the slain of Beitar were allowed burial, the benediction, who is kind and deals kindly, was instituted. Who is kind because they did not putrefy, and deals kindly because they were allowed to be buried. Footnote 60. Jerusalem Talmud Tayanit 4.8, 24a and b. See parallels with some variations at Lamentations Rabbah 2.5 on Lamentations 2.2. And Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 58a, end of footnote. These legends do not constitute a necessary or inherent part of the story of Ben KOKHBA, for they also appear in the Babylonian Talmud. Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 57a, 58a, without mentioning him. Footnote 61. Peter Schaeffer argues in Der Bar KOKHBA, Aufstand, chapter 6, ESP 190 to 193, that most of the legends constituting what he terms the Beitar complex have no historical connection with either Bar KOKHBA or Beitar, but derive from various legendary motifs about warriors and war, or about the First War against Rome, 66 to 70 CE. Schaeffer concludes that redactors used these motifs to transform the later historical figure of Bar KOKHBA and the city of Beitar into a dramatic homily. End of footnote. Nevertheless, the location of the destruction tales in Midrash Lamentations and the Jerusalem Talmud immediately after the Ben KOKHBA legend implies a connection, one which the heavenly voice reinforces in calling Ben KOKHBA a worthless shepherd who abandons the flock to the Roman butchers. The tales of the destruction thereby tell the consequences of Ben KOKHBA's sins and so constitute the denouncement of his story. Yet it is not clear that the storytellers hold Ben KOKHBA exclusively responsible for the destruction of Beitar. Rabbi Elazar's prayer that God not sit in judgment today suggests a generality of sin of the whole city or whole generation, not just one man's. And the stock phrase, Avanot Garmu, sins brought it to pass, in both versions of the story, could likewise refer to the many sins of the multitude. In fact, other legends entirely ignore Ben KOKHBA in explaining the destruction of Beitar. One tradition begins with the statement, over the axle of a carriage Beitar was destroyed, and goes on to show how a trivial misunderstanding between a few Romans and the inhabitants of Beitar led to a catastrophic war out of all proportion to the incident that precipitated it. Footnote. Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 57a, and a footnote. Another tradition attributed to Rabbi Yossi explains that Beitar was destroyed because they lit lamps after the destruction of the temple, rejoicing in the fall of Jerusalem, whose crooked politicians had been robbing Beitar's inhabitants of their land. Footnote. Jerusalem Talmud, Tayanit 4.8, 24a, Lamentations Rabbah 2, verse 5. End of footnote. Whomever the destruction tales fault for the fall of Beitar, they clearly accuse Hadrian and his soldiers of inordinate cruelty after the city had fallen. Vahayu horgan behem vehoken, the text says, and they went on killing them. This relentless savagery by the Romans is one of the main themes of the destruction tales. Another shown by the number of schools and phylactery capsules is the piety of the inhabitants. The version in B. Gittin has the capsules still on the heads of the slain, implying that they died as martyrs to the truth written inside the capsules. The mounds of children's brains and the story of the school children convey a third theme, that of the innocence and helplessness of the victims. What makes the greatest impression, however, is the overwhelming number of people killed, depicted vividly by the torrents of blood, the brains piled in mounds, and the walls of corpses. The destruction of Beitar was remembered principally for this. the annihilation of its entire population. Footnote 64. In contrast to the legends about the Babylonian and Roman conquest of Jerusalem, Lamentations, Rabbah 1:39 and 45-48, 2, 4, and 23, 4, 4 and 11-12, and Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 56b, and the Roman destruction of Judean towns 2-4, 2 and 4, only the conquest of Beitar was remembered for the ruthless extermination of an entire population. The other tales speak of different kinds of suffering, such as famine, deportation, enslavement, and desecration of the temple. End of footnote. Nothing else in rabbinic literature equals these legends for the horror and revulsion they elicit. Told orally, they must have shocked and dismayed those who heard them, stirring up pain and terror. Listeners would have felt pity for the helpless victims, anger at the Romans, and grief over the disastrous outcome of this last great war against the Roman Empire. Because the story of Ben KOKHBA precedes these scenes, his image became irrevocably linked with the carnage and bloodshed that marked the end of Beitar. Implications of the story. I have argued that the legends about Bar Kokhba in the Jerusalem Talmud and Midrash Lamentations portray him in the character of a charismatic warrior, displaying the same extraordinary physical strength as the biblical Gibborim of rabbinic legend, as well as their characteristic virtues and vices, the danger and glory of their strength. At the same time, this image of Bar Kokhba bears some resemblance to Greek legendary heroes and to Isaiah's image of Sennacherib. 2 Kings 19:21-28, and as a narrative protagonist, Ben KOKHBA undergoes the sudden recognition and plot reversal suffered by heroes of Greek tragedy. We must now ask about the political and religious implications of the story. Before doing so, however, let us return to the legends and review them with an eye to their rhetorical and dramatic effects upon the people hearing or reading them. For they are clearly intended to teach a lesson, and they do so not only through their thematic content, their logos in Greek rhetorical terminology, but also through the emotional effects of the narrative on the character of the audience, pathos and ethos. Footnote 65. See John H. McKean, Classical Rhetoric for Modern Discourse, New York, 1969. End of footnote. Aristotle attempted, in Poetics and Rhetoric, to describe the effect of tragedy and oratory on an audience, and this way of understanding the story will help us discern its function in fostering political attitudes and affecting religious perceptions. Audience response. According to Aristotle's theories, the audience's response to the unfolding story of Ben KOKHBA would follow a pattern corresponding to the changing ethos of Ben KOKHBA, that is, the way in which he is presented, whether in an admirable or blameworthy light. At the beginning of the story he appears wholly admirable. His strength and courage in battle and his goal of freeing Israel all seem praiseworthy, so that listeners begin by admiring him. He is doing in a superior way what they themselves want to do. But as the story progresses, listeners gradually discover faults in Ben KOKHBA's character. Hearing the battle prayer voiced in its arrogant tone, they discover the overweening pride he takes in his own strength, presumptuously refusing to trust in God. His ignorance of the crucial role of Rabbi Elazar's prayers, while being himself dependent on them, reveals a blind disregard for the truth, particularly the truth of God's involvement in the outcome of the war. This gradual discovery of faults in a man who had at first appeared admirable might raise questions in the minds of the listeners, since they had begun by identifying with his goals and valuing his strength. How would they themselves have acted in his place? Did they really trust God to provide for Israel? What is it that brings victory? And what is the role of the Gibor in promoting the nation's welfare? They might also recall legends about biblical Gibborim, who used their strength in sinful ways. Then the Kuthian enters the story. When he succeeds easily in outwitting Ben Kokhba, listeners perceive the limitations of Ben Kokhba's strength. His overconfidence, quick anger, and simplicity have tripped him up in the deceptive world presented by the figure of the Kuthian. With Ben Kokhba's execution of Rabbi Elazar, listeners discern the dark destructive potential in Ben Kokhba's strength. They see that this apparently glorious strength has destroyed the cause it tried to serve, has brought the opposite of its intended outcome. Finally, when the heavenly voice intervenes to judge Ben Kokhba for his sins, listeners assent readily to the verdict of guilt. Yet listeners are not allowed to repudiate him entirely, for they would apprehend in the manner of his death the magnitude not only of his shame but also of his glory. As suggested earlier, it was to Ben Kokhba's shame that God had intervened to strike him down, but it was to his glory that he had never been defeated by Rome. The story thus upholds an image of Ben Kokhba in which listeners could take pride as a splendid hero of Israel's past, and invites them to remember him with both pride and disapproval together. Such an ethos resolved the conflicting aspect of Ben Kokhba's character by saving the glory of his strength while warning of its danger. In addition, by nullifying Rome's conquest of Ben Kokhba, the story turns Betar's defeat into victory. Not the kind that the audience would have preferred, but a victory for the justice of God, which the story encourages the audience to comprehend and to accept. Now the storyteller recounts the horrible scenes of Betar's end. Connecting them with the story of Ben Kokhba implies that Betar's destruction was an act of divine judgment, and hence necessary, issuing out of the justice and righteousness of God. This perspective opens up a redeeming dimension to the catastrophe, allowing listeners to make peace with the event and its consequences for themselves. These scenes also constitute a warning about the danger of men like Ben Kokhba, and show how grave the consequences are of one's conduct and attitude toward God. Listeners might therefore be moved to examine themselves and to ask whether they did not still deserve their present sufferings.